Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The humid Philippine air hung thick around our simple dwelling as I lay on my woven sleeping mat, staring up at the thatched ceiling. It was well past midnight in 1987, and the rural countryside around us seemed unusually quiet. Even the typical chorus of insects had fallen to a whisper. The other 5 missionaries sharing our modest hut had long since drifted off, their steady breathing creating the only sounds in our cramped quarters. Our lodging was nothing more than a basic structure. 2 small rooms with bamboo walls and a corrugated metal roof that amplified every raindrop during the monsoon season. We used it primarily for sleeping and changing clothes, spending most of our daylight hours out in the villages teaching about God and the gospel. The floorboards creaked with every movement, and gaps between the wooden planks allowed the occasional gecko to dart through, seeking insects in the shadows. I shifted uncomfortably on my mat, feeling the rough fibers through the thin blanket. My mind raced with thoughts of the day's missionary work and tomorrow's planned visits to remote villages. The oppressive heat made rest difficult, and beads of sweat gathered on my forehead despite the late hour. As the group's leader, I carried the weight of responsibility for both the male and female missionaries in our area, a burden that often kept me awake longer than the others. The darkness outside seemed impenetrable, broken only by the faint glow of stars through our single window. No electric lights illuminated the dirt roads or scattered homes in this remote region. We relied on kerosene lanterns and candles for light after sunset, and both had long been extinguished. The isolation felt complete, as if we existed in a pocket of the world forgotten by civilization. Something felt different tonight, though I couldn't place exactly what. The air carried an unusual stillness, as if the very atmosphere held its breath. My skin prickled with an inexplicable unease that had nothing to do with the temperature or humidity. Years later, I would recognize this feeling as the calm before a storm, but that night, I simply attributed it to exhaustion and homesickness. The thunderous pounding on our front door shattered the silence like a gunshot. I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs as the sound echoed through our small space. The other missionaries stirred immediately, confusion and alarm written across their faces in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. "Munich? What in God's name?" muttered Timothy, my daily companion, as he struggled to orient himself on his sleeping mat. The knocking continued, frantic and desperate, accompanied now by muffled voices calling our names. I recognized the higher-pitched tones of the female missionaries, but their words were garbled by fear and urgency. As I stumbled toward the door, my bare feet finding the rough wooden planks, the other men gathered behind me, rubbing sleep from their eyes. I unlatched the simple wooden door and pulled it open to reveal all 6 female missionaries huddled on our small porch. Their faces were pale as moonlight, eyes wide with terror that seemed to penetrate straight through me. Patricia, their group leader, stood at the front, her usually composed demeanor completely shattered. Her hands trembled visibly, and she kept glancing over her shoulder toward their dwelling across the cleared patch of earth that separated our buildings. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the night sounds. "We can't go back there. Something's wrong with the house." The other women nodded frantically, some wiping tears from their cheeks, others wrapping their arms around themselves despite the warm night air. Lucy, typically the most outspoken of the group, seemed unable to speak at all, her mouth opening and closing without producing sound. "Slow down," I said, stepping aside to let them into our cramped space. "What happened?" Patricia took a shuddering breath, her words tumbling out in a rush. "We were just sitting in the main room talking about tomorrow's plans, getting ready to settle in for the night." Then Monica mentioned feeling like someone was watching her from the corner. "We laughed it off at first, you know, but then Isabella felt it too. And then all of us." She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "It wasn't just the feeling of being observed. It was like like something had filled up the empty spaces in the house. The shadows seemed deeper, the corners darker than they should have been. The temperature dropped noticeably, which shouldn't happen in this climate. We could sense a presence moving through the rooms, even though we couldn't see anything. The other women murmured their agreement, sharing fragments of their experience. They described feeling watched by invisible eyes, hearing sounds that had no source, and experiencing an overwhelming urge to flee that grew stronger with each passing minute. "We tried to rationalize it," added Monica, her voice shaking. "Told ourselves we were just tired, that our minds were playing tricks." But the feeling kept intensifying until we couldn't stand it anymore. We all ran for the door at the same time, practically trampling each other to get out. As the appointed leader of our mission group, the responsibility for handling this situation fell squarely on my shoulders. I looked around at the frightened faces of the women and the concerned expressions of my fellow male missionaries. Whatever had occurred in their dwelling, it had genuinely terrified 6 intelligent, faithful young women who had already endured months of challenging missionary work in a foreign country. "We need to investigate," I announced, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "If there's something wrong with the house, we need to know what it is." Timothy immediately volunteered, along with Porter, Gregory, Benedict, and Zane. The 6 of us would go, while the women remained safely in our hut. I grabbed our largest flashlight and checked that the batteries were still strong. The beam cut through the darkness with reassuring brightness, though it seemed somehow inadequate for the task ahead. We stepped out into the night air, which felt cooler than it had earlier, unusual for the consistently warm Philippine climate. Our bare feet made soft sounds on the packed earth as we walked the short distance to the women's dwelling. Behind us, I could hear the muffled voices of the female missionaries who had clustered together in our main room, their conversation rapid and anxious. The women's house stood before us like a monument to colonial history, its weathered wooden frame elevated on sturdy stilts. Built around 1780 by Spanish colonizers, it represented a style of architecture designed to withstand both the tropical climate and the occasional political upheaval that had marked the Philippines' turbulent past. The structure contained 10 to 12 rooms, far more spacious than our simple hut, with high ceilings and wide windows designed to promote air circulation. Our mission organization had arranged to use the building through its elderly owner, Diego Vasquez, whose grandfather had constructed it as a family compound. Before departing for Manila to live with his daughter, Diego had shared the house's history with our mission supervisors, including some details that now seemed more significant than they had at the time. The front porch stretched across the entire width of the building, supported by thick wooden posts that had darkened with age and weather. Decorative carved elements adorned the eaves, though many had suffered damage from decades of monsoons and neglect. The main entrance consisted of heavy wooden double doors, painted green many years ago, but now faded to a mottled gray-brown. As we approached, the house appeared completely normal from the outside. No lights flickered in the windows, no sounds emerged from within, no signs of disturbance marked the surrounding area. Yet something felt fundamentally wrong, as if the very air around the building carried an invisible weight. Standing before the imposing structure, I recalled the conversation our mission supervisors had shared about the house's tragic past. Diego Vasquez had been reluctant to discuss it initially, but eventually felt obligated to inform us of the events that had occurred on the property. In 1953, during the aftermath of World War II, unexploded ordnance still littered the Philippine countryside. American, Japanese, and local forces had fought fierce battles throughout the islands, leaving behind a deadly legacy of abandoned weapons and explosives. Most areas had been cleared by military teams, but remote locations like ours often harbored forgotten dangers. Get this. On a sweltering afternoon in late June, 4 local children, 2 brothers and 2 sisters ranging in age from 7 to 12, had been playing around the elevated house. The space beneath the structure provided shade from the intense sun and created a natural playground where children could imagine themselves in secret hideouts or jungle adventures. While exploring the dusty area under the floorboards, one of the children discovered what appeared to be an interesting metal object partially buried in the dirt. It was roughly the size and shape of a large pineapple, with ridged sides and a rusty metal surface. To their young eyes, it looked like a fascinating toy, or perhaps a container that might hold treasures. The children pulled the object free from the earth, passing it between them and examining its weight and texture. They speculated about its origins, with one suggesting it might be a piece of farming equipment and another proposing it could be a decorative item that had fallen from the house above. What they had actually discovered was a Japanese Type 97 hand grenade, its metal casing weakened by over a decade of exposure to tropical humidity and soil acids. The firing mechanism, while corroded, remained functional enough to respond to the manipulation and impact the children innocently inflicted upon it. The explosion occurred without warning, its force concentrated in the confined space beneath the house. All 4 children died instantly, their bodies torn apart by the blast and flying debris. The wooden floor above sustained significant damage, and several support posts cracked from the concussion. The sound reportedly carried for miles across the rural landscape, bringing neighbors running from their distant farms. Diego's grandfather had witnessed the aftermath. The destroyed earth beneath his home, the grieving families, the military investigators who arrived to determine the source of the explosion. The tragedy haunted the property for decades, with local residents claiming to hear unusual sounds and experience strange phenomena in and around the building. Armed with this knowledge, our small group approached the house with considerably more apprehension. The historical tragedy provided context for the women's experience, though I tried to maintain a rational perspective about supernatural claims. As missionaries, we believed in spiritual realities, but we also understood the power of suggestion and how knowledge of past events could influence perception. "Let's check if they locked themselves out," Timothy suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. We climbed the wooden steps to the main porch, each creak seeming amplified in the nighttime silence. The front door stood closed, and when I turned the handle, it refused to budge. A quick check revealed that the deadbolt had been engaged from the inside, something that should have been impossible if the women had fled the building. "How did they lock it from inside if they all ran out?" Gregory asked, voicing the question we were all thinking. We circled the building, testing every door and window. The back entrance was similarly locked, as were all the ground floor windows. The upper story windows were too high to reach without a ladder, and we could see no signs of forced entry or disturbance anywhere around the perimeter. Returning to the front porch, I stared at the locked doors with growing frustration. The women needed their belongings, including medication and personal items they couldn't do without. More importantly, if something had genuinely occurred inside the house, we needed to understand what it was and ensure it posed no ongoing danger. "Yep. Stand back," I told the others, taking several steps away from the entrance. Drawing on reserves of adrenaline and determination, I launched myself forward, driving my right foot into the door just beside the handle with all the force I could muster. The aged wood splintered with a crack that seemed to echo across the entire countryside. The door frame gave way, and both doors swung inward, revealing the dark interior beyond. Our flashlight beam penetrated the gloom, illuminating the main room where the women had been sitting hours earlier. Furniture remained in its proper positions, personal belongings appeared undisturbed, and nothing seemed obviously out of place. The familiar scent of the house, a mixture of old wood, tropical humidity, and the faint traces of kerosene from the lanterns, greeted us as we stepped inside. We moved methodically through the rooms, checking closets, looking under beds, examining every space large enough to conceal a person. The house revealed nothing unusual until we reached a door in the back corridor that none of us could open. Unlike the other doors in the building, this one was secured with a heavy padlock that showed no signs of rust or age. "The women mentioned they didn't have a key for one closet," Porter recalled. "This must be it." The door itself was made of the same dark wood as the rest of the house, but it appeared to have been reinforced with additional planks on the outside. Metal brackets held the padlock mechanism, and the hardware looked far newer than the colonial-era construction surrounding it. Someone had clearly taken special measures to secure whatever lay behind this particular door. We decided to dismiss the locked closet as irrelevant to the evening's events. After all, if it had been secured when the women moved in, it couldn't be connected to their recent experience. I sent word back to our hut that the women should gather their essential belongings for the night and plan to sleep in our quarters, while we would remain in the larger house until morning. The broken front door could no longer provide security, making it necessary for someone to maintain watch throughout the night. Besides, if the women had genuinely experienced something supernatural, our presence might provide protection or at least documentation of any recurring phenomena. The female missionaries arrived shortly after our message, moving quickly through their house to collect toiletries, medication, and changes of clothing. They avoided looking toward the locked closet and spoke in hushed tones, clearly eager to leave as quickly as possible. Within 30 minutes, they had gathered everything they needed and returned to our hut. Left alone in the spacious colonial house, our group of 6 men settled into the main room with a deck of cards, some bottled water, and a few snacks. We arranged chairs in a circle and began a game of poker using matches as stakes. The familiar routine of dealing cards and making bets provided a comforting normalcy that helped counteract the unsettling atmosphere. The house felt different at night than it had during our investigation. Shadows gathered in corners that seemed deeper than they should be, and the wooden structure creaked and settled with sounds that appeared more frequent and pronounced than typical thermal contraction would produce. Every few minutes, we would pause our game to listen as an unexplained sound filtered through the rooms. Just the house adjusting to the temperature change, Benedict rationalized when we heard what sounded like footsteps in an upstairs room. Old buildings make noise, agreed Zane after a series of creaks emanated from the direction of the back corridor. As the night progressed, however, the sounds became more difficult to dismiss. We heard what sounded like doors closing in distant rooms, despite the fact that we had left all doors open during our search. Soft, scratching noises seemed to come from within the walls, as if something was moving through the spaces between rooms. Most unsettling was an occasional sound that resembled muffled voices, too indistinct to understand, but clearly human in origin. Around 2:30 a.m., exhaustion began to overcome our vigilance. The card game had devolved into half-hearted play, with most of us struggling to keep our eyes open. Porter had already dozed off in his chair, and Gregory was nodding intermittently as he held his cards. "Maybe we should try to get some rest," Timothy suggested, stifling a yawn. "We can take turns keeping watch." I agreed, knowing that we all needed to be functional for the next day's missionary work. We arranged our chairs to form sleeping areas and settled in with whatever cushions and blankets we could find. The main room provided enough space for all of us, and staying together seemed preferable to spreading throughout the house. Just as we were beginning to drift into genuine sleep, that moment when consciousness starts to fade and the mind releases its grip on immediate surroundings, an explosion of sound erupted from the direction of the locked closet. The noise was unlike anything I had ever heard. A thunderous crash combined with what sounded like a muffled detonation, as if something massive had fallen from a great height onto a hard surface. Timothy sprang from his improvised bed with such force that his chair toppled backward, clattering across the wooden floor. In the same instant, I found myself fully awake and on my feet, my heart pounding with the sudden surge of adrenaline that accompanies unexpected shock. "What the hell was that?" Porter shouted. His previous drowsiness completely vanished. Without hesitation, Timothy ran toward the back corridor, his bare feet slapping against the floorboards. I followed immediately, the other men close behind. Our flashlight beam danced wildly as we rushed through the house, illuminating walls and doorways in chaotic sweeps. We reached the locked closet door and found it exactly as we had left it, securely padlocked with no signs of disturbance. Timothy began pounding on the wooden surface with his fists, his knuckles making sharp impacts that echoed through the hallway. "Open up!" he yelled, continuing to hammer against the door. "What's in there? Open this door!" I joined him. Adding my own fists to the assault on the wooden barrier, the sound we had heard had definitely originated from this location, yet the door remained locked and showed no evidence of having been opened. The padlock hung undisturbed, the metal brackets remained firmly attached, and even the dust patterns around the door frame appeared unchanged. After several minutes of futile pounding, we stopped our efforts. The house had fallen completely silent again, as if the tremendous noise had never occurred. No sounds emerged from behind the locked door, no movement could be detected within the closet space, and no explanation presented itself for what we had experienced. "I'm going to check outside," I announced, grabbing the flashlight and heading for the broken front door. The night air felt cool against my sweat-dampened skin as I circled the building, searching for any external explanation for the noise. I examined the ground beneath the house, looking for signs of impact or disturbance. I checked the windows near the locked closet to see if they showed any damage or displacement. I even climbed partially under the elevated structure, shining the flashlight beam into the shadows where the tragic explosion had occurred decades earlier. Nothing. No evidence of falling objects, no displaced earth, no structural damage, no indication that anything physical had occurred to produce such a tremendous sound. The house stood as solid and undisturbed as it had when we first approached it hours earlier. Returning to the interior, I found the other men gathered in the main room, their faces reflecting the same confusion and unease I felt. We had all heard the sound clearly, loud enough to wake us from the edge of sleep, distinctive enough to identify its apparent source, powerful enough to suggest significant physical impact. Yet we could find no evidence that anything had actually happened. "Could it have been thunder?" Gregory suggested hopefully. "Maybe a storm approaching." We listened for several minutes, but no additional sounds of weather reached us. The night remained clear, with stars still visible through the windows, and no signs of approaching clouds or wind. "That wasn't thunder," Benedict said quietly. "Thunder doesn't sound like that, and it doesn't come from inside locked closets." As we sat in the circle of chairs, trying to process what we had experienced, the implications of the house's history began to settle more heavily upon us. The tragic explosion that had killed 4 children, the confined space beneath the building where they had died, the tremendous force that had torn them apart and damaged the structure above, all of these elements seemed to echo in the sound we had just heard. "Do you think," Timothy said slowly, "that we might have heard an echo? Something replaying from the past?" I wanted to dismiss the idea as imagination influenced by knowledge of the tragedy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he might be right. The sound had possessed a muffled quality consistent with something occurring beneath the house, yet it had seemed to emanate from the locked closet directly above that space. The timing, deep in the night when our defenses were lowered and our minds most open to influence, suggested something beyond mere coincidence. "I don't know what we heard," I admitted finally, "but I believe we heard something real, something connected to this place and its history." Check. We remained in the house until dawn, but no additional phenomena occurred. As the first light of morning filtered through the windows, the building resumed its normal character of an old colonial structure with creaking floorboards and settling timbers. The oppressive atmosphere that had weighed upon us during the night seemed to lift with the darkness. When the women returned to collect their belongings and prepare for the day's missionary work, they listened to our account with knowing expressions. They had experienced something genuine in this house, something that defied rational explanation, but demanded acknowledgement nonetheless. We never discovered what lay behind the locked closet door, and I never learned whether subsequent missionary groups experienced similar phenomena. But to this day, more than 3 decades later, I can still hear that sound in my memory, the tremendous crash that seemed to carry within it the echo of a tragedy that occurred long before we arrived, yet continues to resonate in that place where 4 children lost their lives to the random cruelty of war's forgotten remnants. The experience taught me that some events leave impressions that transcend time, and that bearing witness to such impressions, however inexplicable they might be, constitutes its own form of sacred responsibility. In serving God through missionary work, we sometimes encounter mysteries that challenge our understanding while deepening our faith in forces beyond the immediate and tangible. That house in the Philippine countryside stands as a testament to the persistence of memory, the weight of tragedy, and the thin boundaries between past and present that occasionally collapse in the darkest hours of the night. When you live in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest, every creak of the wood and rustle of leaves has a story to tell. I should know. I've spent most of my life among these ancient trees, listening to their secrets and bearing witness to the mysteries they hold. My name is Hank Lawson, and for over 30 years I've called this forest my home. My cabin, a humble structure made of logs and memories, sits near a secluded river bend where the water flows slow and silent, like a secret whispered in the night. It's a simple life, one governed by the rhythms of nature and the changing of the seasons. Out here, the modern world feels like a distant dream, a fading echo drowned out by the song of the wind through the pines. Cheers. I first came to these woods as a young man, eager to escape the noise and chaos of the city. I'd grown up in Seattle, a child of concrete and asphalt, but something in me had always yearned for the wild places, the untamed corners of the world where man's influence had yet to take hold. So, when an opportunity arose to work as a forest ranger in one of the most remote areas of the state, I leapt at the chance. Those early years were a revelation, a baptism into a world I'd only ever glimpsed from afar. I spent my days patrolling the vast expanses of the forest, learning the lay of the land and the ways of the creatures that called it home. At night, I would sit by the fire, listening to the old-timers spin yarns about the history of the region, tales of loggers and homesteaders, of fortunes made and lives lost in the green embrace of the woods. As time passed, I found myself growing more and more attached to this wild and unforgiving landscape. The solitude that had once seemed so daunting became a comfort, a balm to my restless spirit. I came to appreciate the subtle beauty of the forest, the way the light filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with gold, the soft sigh of the wind through the branches, the timeless majesty of the trees that had stood sentinel for centuries. When my time as a ranger came to an end, I knew I could never go back to the city, to the life I had left behind. The forest had claimed me, body and soul, and I had no desire to be anywhere else. And so, with little more than a few hand tools and a dream, I set about building my cabin in a quiet corner of the woods, a place where I could live out my days in harmony with the land. For years, life in the forest was everything I had hoped for. My days were filled with the simple tasks of survival, chopping wood, tending to my small garden, fishing in the clear waters of the river. In the evenings, I would sit on my porch, a cup of coffee in hand, and watch the sun paint the sky in shades of fire as it sank below the horizon. It was a peaceful existence, one that seemed almost untouched by the passage of time. But as the saying goes, all good things must come to an end. And for me, that end began in the summer of 1980, when the shadows in the forest seemed to grow longer and the nights grew heavy with a sense of foreboding that I couldn't quite shake. It was an evening in late July, and the sun was setting later and later, casting long shadows that danced eerily through the woods. I was out chopping wood, a routine task that had become almost meditative over the years. There was something soothing about the rhythmic thwack of the axe against the log, the clean scent of pine, and the distant hoot of an owl as it called out to the gathering dusk. Rufus, my loyal German shepherd, lay nearby, his muzzle resting on his paws as he watched me work. He'd been my constant companion for nearly a decade, a sturdy and fearless presence at my side through all the challenges of forest life. But lately I'd noticed a change in his demeanor, a restlessness that seemed out of character for the usually unflappable dog. As I split the last log and added it to the growing pile, I paused to wipe the sweat from my brow and take a swig of water from my canteen. That's when I noticed Rufus. He was standing at attention, his ears perked and his body rigid as he stared into the deepening shadows of the tree line. A low growl rumbled in his throat, a sound I'd never heard him make before. "What is it, boy?" I asked, setting down my axe and moving to stand beside him. "You see something out there?" But Rufus didn't respond, didn't even spare me a glance. His gaze remained fixed on the forest, his hackles raised and his teeth bared in a silent snarl. I followed his line of sight, squinting into the gathering darkness, but I could see nothing out of the ordinary, just the familiar tangle of trunks and undergrowth that had been my backdrop for so many years. Yes. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. There was a heaviness to the air, a sense of expectation that set my nerves on edge. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild, but the unease lingered, like a splinter buried deep beneath the skin. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences began to mount. It started with small things, easily dismissed. Branches snapping in the night, the prickling sensation of being watched as I went about my chores. But as the weeks wore on, the incidents grew more frequent and more unsettling. Rufus's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would pace the perimeter of the clearing, growling at the shadows and refusing to venture into the forest, even when I called him. It was as if he sensed something out there, some threat that my human senses couldn't perceive. Then came the night that changed everything. The night that shattered the peace of my forest idyll and set me on a path I never could have imagined. It was a moonless night, the kind of darkness that seems to swallow the world whole. I was sitting by the fire, nursing a mug of coffee, and trying to shake off the unease that had become my constant companion in recent weeks. Rufus lay at my feet, his eyes glinting in the flickering light of the flames. Suddenly, the stillness of the night was shattered by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a scream, a high, piercing wail that seemed to go on forever, echoing through the trees like a banshee's cry. But it wasn't the scream of an animal, not the yowl of a coyote or the shriek of a mountain lion. No, this was a human scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that chilled me to my very core. I was on my feet in an instant, my heart pounding in my chest. Rufus was up too, his ears flattened against his skull and his teeth bared in a snarl. I grabbed my shotgun from its place by the door and clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. "Come on, boy," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to check this out." And with that, we set off into the night, the forest closing in around us like a living thing. Little did I know, as I took those first steps into the darkness, that I was embarking on a journey that would test the very limits of my sanity and force me to confront the darkest corners of the human soul. The scream had come from deep within the forest, near an old abandoned mine shaft that had been a fixture of the landscape for as long as anyone could remember. The mine had been closed down decades ago, its entrance boarded up and its tunnels left to the mercy of time and the elements. But there were stories about the place, whispered tales of dark deeds and unspeakable horrors that had taken place in its depths. As a ranger, I had always dismissed such stories as mere folklore, the product of overactive imaginations and too many nights spent around the campfire. But now, as Rufus and I made our way through the darkness, the beam of my flashlight barely penetrating the gloom, I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of dread, as if those old tales might hold more truth than I'd ever dared to believe. The forest was eerily quiet as we walked, the only sound the crunching of our footsteps on the leaf-strewn ground and the occasional snap of a twig under Rufus's paws. The air was thick and heavy, laden with the scent of decay and something else, something that set my teeth on edge and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As we drew closer to the mine, I began to notice signs of recent activity. Broken branches, scuffed earth, and the unmistakable imprint of boot treads in the soft soil. It was clear that someone had been here, and recently, but who would venture so deep into the forest, so far from any trail or human habitation? The answer came as we rounded a bend in the path, and the entrance to the mine came into view. The boards that had once blocked the entrance had been torn away, splintered wood lying scattered on the ground. And there, in the gaping maw of the tunnel, a flicker of light, the warm glow of a campfire dancing on the rough-hewn walls. Cheers. Rufus let out a low whine, his body pressed close to my leg as if seeking reassurance. I reached down and gave him a quick pat, my own heart hammering in my chest. Then, taking a deep breath, I stepped forward, my shotgun at the ready. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the oppressive silence. "Is anyone there?" For a moment, there was no response, just the echo of my own words bouncing back at me from the depths of the mine. But then, as I took another step forward, I heard it. A soft rustling, the sound of movement from within the tunnel. I tightened my grip on the shotgun, my finger hovering over the trigger. "I'm armed," I said, my voice steady despite the fear that churned in my gut. "Come out slowly, with your hands up." Silence. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man, his face obscured by a tangle of matted hair and a wild, unkempt beard. He was dressed in filthy, tattered clothing, his skin smeared with grime and what looked like dried blood. In his hand he clutched a knife, the blade glinting dully in the light of my flashlight. "You don't belong here," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "The forest is mine. It speaks to me, tells me to keep it pure." I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Put down the knife," I said, fighting to keep my voice calm. "We can talk about this. I'm here to help." "Yeah." But the man just shook his head, a feverish light in his eyes. "No one can help me," he said. "The forest demands a sacrifice. It must be fed." And with that, he lunged forward, the knife slashing through the air. I stumbled back, my finger tightening on the trigger, but before I could fire, Rufus leapt into action. With a snarl, he launched himself at the man, his teeth sinking into the flesh of his arm. The man howled in pain, the knife clattering to the ground as he struggled to free himself from Rufus's grip. I used the distraction to my advantage, closing the distance between us and bringing the butt of my shotgun down on the man's head with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the ground, blood trickling from a gash on his temple. Rufus stood over him, hackles raised, until I called him off. With shaking hands, I checked the man's pulse, relief washing over me as I felt the steady thrum beneath my fingers. It was only then, as the adrenaline began to fade, that I noticed the campsite, tucked away in a corner of the mine shaft. There was a small fire burning, its flickering light illuminating a scattering of personal effects, a backpack, a sleeping bag, a few cans of food. And there, huddled against the far wall, a figure, small and still. My heart in my throat, I approached, the beam of my flashlight falling on a young woman, her eyes wide and filled with terror. She was filthy, her clothes torn and her skin marred with bruises and cuts. But she was alive. And as I knelt beside her, she reached out and clutched at my arm with a desperate strength. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Help me." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. I managed to get the young woman, who introduced herself as Emily, back to my cabin, where I tended to her wounds and made her as comfortable as I could. She was in rough shape, dehydrated and malnourished, her body bearing the marks of her ordeal. But she was alive, and for that, I was grateful. As for the man from the mine, I had bound his hands and feet and left him under Rufus's watchful eye while I hiked out to the nearest ranger station to report what had happened. It was a long, arduous trek, made all the more difficult by the weight of the last few hours pressing down on me. By the time I reached the station, I was exhausted, my mind reeling with questions and doubts. The rangers listened to my story with a mixture of shock and disbelief, their faces growing grimmer as I recounted the details of the man's attack and Emily's rescue. They assured me that they would handle the situation from here, that I had done the right thing by coming to them. But as I made my way back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the dark secrets of the forest were just starting to unravel. Over the next few days, as Emily began to regain her strength, she told me her story. She had been hiking alone, she said, a solo trek through the wilderness to clear her head and find some peace after a difficult year. She had been setting up camp when the man had appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, his eyes wild and his knife glinting in the fading light. He had taken her by surprise, overpowering her easily and dragging her deep into the forest, to the abandoned mine where he had made his lair. There, he had kept her prisoner, ranting about the voices in his head and the sacrifices demanded by the forest. But as I listened to her story, a chill ran down my spine. I had heard tales of the old mine, of course, whispered legends of dark rituals and unspeakable acts carried out in its depths. But I had always dismissed them as mere stories, the product of overactive imaginations and too much time spent in the isolation of the woods. Now, though, I couldn't help but wonder if there might be some truth to those old tales. The man's ravings about the forest, his talk of sacrifices and dark demands, it all seemed to point to something deeper, something that went beyond the actions of a lone, disturbed individual. I shared my concerns with Emily, and to my surprise, she nodded in agreement. She had heard the man's rantings, she said, had listened to his feverish mutterings as he paced the confines of the mine, and she had come to believe that there was something out there, something ancient and malevolent that called to him, that drove him to commit the unspeakable acts. Together, we pored over the man's belongings, the few meager possessions he had left behind in the mine. Among them, we found a battered journal, its pages filled with cramped, frenzied writing that spoke of dark visions and whispered commands from the depths of the forest. As we read through the journal, a picture began to emerge of a man slowly losing his grip on reality, consumed by a belief in a dark power lurking in the heart of the woods. He wrote of a presence that watched him from the shadows, a force that demanded blood and sacrifice in exchange for its favor. The more we read, the more convinced I became that there was something truly evil at work in the forest, something that went beyond the ravings of a madman, and I knew that I couldn't rest until I had uncovered the truth, no matter where it might lead me. In the days that followed, I threw myself into the investigation, determined to unravel the mystery of the dark presence in the woods. I spent long hours combing through old records and newspaper archives, searching for any mention of strange occurrences or unsolved disappearances in the area. What I found was a chilling tapestry of darkness stretching back decades, a history of vanishings and unexplained events that had been all but forgotten by the outside world. There were stories of hikers who had ventured into the woods and never returned, of strange lights and eerie sounds emanating from the depths of the forest. And always at the center of it all, the abandoned mine, like a dark heart pulsing with malevolent energy. The more I dug, the more convinced I became that the mine was the key to the mystery, that whatever evil lurked in the forest had its roots in that ancient, forsaken place. Emily, too, was haunted by the unanswered questions, the lingering shadows of her ordeal. She had returned to the city to try to pick up the pieces of her life, but I could see in her eyes that she would never be truly free of the forest's grip, not until the truth was. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, I knew that I had to confront the darkness head-on. I couldn't let the evil that lurked in the forest continue to claim innocent lives, to spread its malevolent influence unchecked. I gathered my courage and my gear and set out for the mine, determined to put an end to the nightmare once and for all. Rufus, ever loyal, walked by my side, his presence a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. The journey through the woods was a test of nerves, every shadow and rustling leaf a potential threat. But I pressed on, driven by a grim determination to see this through to the end. When I reached the mine, I found it much as I had left it, the entrance gaping like a wound in the earth. But there was a palpable sense of malice emanating from its depths, a cold, creeping dread that seemed to seep into my very bones. I descended into the darkness, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The air grew thick and heavy, the stench of decay and something else, something ancient and foul, filling my nostrils. As I made my way deeper into the mine, I began to hear whispers, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from every direction at once, a cacophony of hissing voices that clawed at the edges of my sanity. "Leave this place," they whispered. "You do not belong here." But I pressed on, gritting my teeth against the rising tide of fear. I knew that I was close to the source of the evil, that the heart of the darkness lay just ahead. And then I saw it, a pulsing mass of shadow and malice, a swirling vortex of pure, unbridled evil. It seemed to fill the entire chamber, a living, breathing thing that radiated a cold, hungry intelligence. I raised my weapon, my hands shaking as I took aim at the heart of the darkness. But before I could pull the trigger, a figure emerged from the shadows, the man from the mine, his eyes blazing with a feverish light. "You cannot destroy it," he hissed. "It is eternal, undying. It will consume you, as it has consumed me." But I wasn't listening. With a roar of defiance, I opened fire, emptying my gun into the writhing mass of shadows. Rufus lunged forward, his teeth bared in a snarl as he tore at the inky tendrils that lashed out at us. Bayern. For a moment, it seemed as if the darkness would overwhelm us, that we would be swallowed whole by the malevolent force that had haunted the forest for so long. But then, with a final, ear-splitting shriek, the entity began to dissipate, shredding apart like mist in the sunlight. As the last wisps of shadow faded away, I sank to my knees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Rufus limped over to me, his muzzle flecked with black ichor, and I buried my face in his fur, tears of relief and exhaustion streaming down my face. It was over. The evil that had plagued the forest was gone, banished back to the dark corners of the world from whence it came. But as I made my way out of the mine, supporting the broken, sobbing form of the man who had been its thrall, I knew that the scars it had left behind would linger for a long time to come. Years have passed since that fateful day in the mine, but the memories of what I faced there have never faded. I still wake in the night sometimes, my heart pounding and my skin slick with sweat, the echoes of those whispering voices ringing in my ears. But I take comfort in the knowledge that the forest is free now, that the evil that once lurked in its depths has been banished forever. Emily and I keep in touch, bound by the shared trauma of our experience, and I know that she too has found a measure of peace in the years since. As for me, I still live in my cabin by the river, watching the seasons change and the forest grow and thrive around me. Rufus is gone now, his time on this earth spent, but his memory lives on in the quiet moments, in the rustling of the leaves and the murmur of the water over the rocks. And sometimes, when the sun is setting and the shadows are long, I fancy that I can hear his bark echoing through the trees, a reminder of the bond we shared and the battles we fought together. For in the end, that is the true legacy of the forest. Not the darkness and the fear, but the strength and the resilience of the human spirit, the unbreakable ties that bind us to one another and to the wild, untamed places of the world. And as long as those bonds endure, as long as there are those who are willing to stand against the darkness, no evil can ever truly prevail. The dust kicked up behind my truck as I drove down the familiar gravel road, each bump and rut stirring memories I'd spent years trying to forget. Fall had painted the Ozark mountains in brilliant shades of red and gold, but I barely noticed the beauty. My mind was fixed on what waited at the end of this road, my grandparents' cabin, empty now for 3 years since their passing. I'm Marcus Wheeler, born and raised in Springfield, Missouri, but these mountains had always been my second home. Every summer of my childhood was spent here, learning to fish in the crystal-clear streams, helping Grandpa repair the old cabin's endless quirks, and listening to Grandma's stories about the strange things that lived in these woods. Back then, those tales were just entertainment, meant to keep us kids from wandering too far into the forest. Now, I know better. Rhett Davidson rode shotgun, his familiar presence both comforting and concerning. We'd been best friends since 3rd grade, bonded by our shared love of the outdoors and a tendency to find trouble wherever we went. His family owned property about 20 miles from my grandparents' place, and we'd spent countless weekends exploring these mountains together as teenagers. "Man, this takes me back," Rhett said, running a hand through his sandy hair. He'd hardly changed since high school, still tall and lanky, with that easy smile that made everyone trust him instantly. "Remember when we convinced ourselves there was buried treasure up here?" Dut. I managed to laugh, though it felt hollow. "Yeah, and instead of gold, we found that angry nest of hornets." The memory should have been funny, but something about being back here set my nerves on edge. "Thanks for coming with me, by the way. This would have been a hell of a job alone." The job in question was cleaning out the cabin. After Grandma and Grandpa passed, the place had sat untouched, gathering dust and memories in equal measure. My parents had finally decided it was time to either sell it or fix it up, and I'd volunteered to assess the situation. Maybe it was nostalgia, or maybe something deeper, a need to confront the past before letting it go. More. We rounded the final bend, and there it was. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, its weathered logs and sagging porch telling stories of neglect. The surrounding forest pressed close, as if nature was slowly reclaiming what had been borrowed from it. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, creating patterns that seemed to shift and move when you weren't looking directly at them. "Home sweet home," Rhett muttered, grabbing his duffel bag from the truck bed. "Still can't believe your grandparents lived out here year-round. Closest neighbors, what, 5 miles away?" 7, I corrected, hefting my own bag and the cooler we'd brought. Grandpa always said that was still too close. The key was right where it had always been, hidden in a fake rock by the front steps. Some habits die hard, even in the middle of nowhere. The cabin's interior hit me with a wave of memories and musty air. Everything was exactly as I remembered it. The worn leather armchair where Grandpa would read his Louis L'Amour novels, Grandma's collection of hand-carved wooden animals on the mantel, the ancient radio that only picked up one station, and that only on clear days. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through the windows. "Let's get some air in here," Rhett suggested, already moving to open windows. "Then maybe we can figure out where to start with all this." He gestured vaguely at the accumulated belongings of 2 long lives. We spent the rest of the afternoon taking inventory, sorting through boxes and furniture, making piles for keeping, donating, and trash. It was emotionally exhausting work, each item unearthed carrying its own weight of memories. By the time the sun started to set, we'd barely made a dent. "Think we should head into town for some food?" Rhett asked, wiping dust from his hands. "I saw a diner on the way in." The suggestion was welcome. We'd worked through lunch, and the idea of cooking in the cabin's ancient kitchen didn't appeal. The drive into town was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The diner, Sally's Home Cooking, according to the neon sign, was exactly what you'd expect. Checkered tablecloths, waitresses who called you honey, and portions big enough to feed a small army. It wasn't until we were heading back, bellies full of chicken fried steak and apple pie, that things started to feel off. The sun had set completely, leaving only our headlights to cut through the darkness. The forest seemed different at night, more alive somehow. The shadows between the trees were deeper, more purposeful. Yes. That's when Rhett heard it first. "Did you hear that?" he asked, suddenly alert. His hand reached to lower the radio's volume. I was about to brush it off when it came again. A howl, but not like any coyote or wolf I'd ever heard. It was deeper, almost guttural, with an edge that made my skin crawl. We were almost back to the cabin, the headlights sweeping across the front yard as we pulled up. And there, just at the edge of the light's reach, we saw them. Eyes. Two reflective points in the darkness, set too high off the ground to be any normal animal. They held us in their gaze for what felt like an eternity, unblinking and unnaturally bright.
"That's not a coyote,"
Rhett whispered, his voice tight with tension. No, it wasn't. Whatever stood watching us from the tree line was much larger, its silhouette suggesting a massive, hunched form. A low growl rolled across the yard, deep enough that I could feel it in my chest. Then, with a movement that seemed too fluid for its size, the creature melted back into the darkness. We practically ran into the cabin, checking and double-checking the locks on doors and windows. The night suddenly felt very long and very, very dark. "What the hell was that?" Rhett asked, peering through a window into the blackness outside. "I've never seen anything that big in these woods." I didn't answer immediately, my mind racing back to Grandma's stories. She'd told tales of things that lived in these mountains, things that weren't supposed to exist. I'd always assumed they were just stories meant to keep kids close to home after dark. Now, I wasn't so sure. "Maybe we should head back to Springfield," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come back when we have more daylight to work with." "So?" But Rhett shook his head. "We're already here, and we've got work to do. Besides, whatever it was, it's probably just curious. Animals usually avoid people, right?" I wanted to believe him. We both did. But as we settled in for the night, neither of us quite able to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled into something ancient and dangerous, something that had been waiting in these woods for a very long time. We didn't know it then, but that was just the beginning. The real horror was still to come, waiting in the shadows of the next day's fading light. And by the time we realized what we were dealing with, it would be far too late to run. Morning brought a false sense of security. Sunlight streamed through the windows, birds chirped in the surrounding trees, and last night's encounter seemed almost dreamlike. Almost. We found the tracks in the soft earth around the cabin, massive prints that defied explanation. They were vaguely canine in shape, but far too large, with strange elongations in the toe marks that suggested claws longer than any wolf's should be. And there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. They showed signs of a bipedal gait. "This isn't right," Rhett muttered, crouching to examine one of the clearer prints. "No wolf walks like this. And look at the depth. Whatever made these has to weigh hundreds of pounds." I wanted to dismiss it, to find some rational explanation that would let us get back to our task of cleaning out the cabin. But those prints told a story that couldn't be ignored. Something had been circling the cabin last night, testing our defenses, studying us. We tried to focus on our work, hauling boxes and sorting through years of accumulated possessions. But there was a tension in the air now, a weight that made every shadow seem threatening. We kept checking the windows, starting at every unexpected sound. The day passed slowly, each hour bringing us closer to sunset. Neither of us wanted to acknowledge it, but we both knew what was coming. As the light began to fade, we built a fire in the pit outside, hoping the flames would keep whatever was out there at bay. "We should be armed," I said finally, breaking the uneasy silence. "I've got my hunting rifle in the truck." Rhett nodded, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something harder, more focused. "I brought mine too. Never go into the backwoods without it." We were cooking steaks over the fire when it returned. This time there was no mistaking what we saw. The creature emerged from the tree line with a deliberate slowness, as if it wanted us to get a good look at it. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its form a nightmarish blend of wolf and human. Dirty white fur covered its muscled frame, matted in places with what looked horribly like dried blood. Its face was the worst part. Too long to be human, too expressive to be animal. And those eyes, burning with an intelligence that spoke of something far more than mere bestial hunger. The creature's growl shattered the evening silence. Our guns were in the truck, just 30 yards away, but it might as well have been 30 miles. The beast stood between us and any hope of reaching them. Inside, I hissed, backing slowly toward the cabin. Move slow. Rhett's face had gone pale, his eyes fixed on the monster. "Marcus," he whispered, "if that thing charges." He didn't need to finish the thought. We both knew our chances of making it to the cabin were slim. The creature seemed to sense our fear, its lips pulling back in what could almost be called a smile, revealing rows of yellowed fangs. We made it about halfway to the door when it moved. The speed was impossible. One moment it was at the tree line, the next it was barely 10 feet away. Rhett stumbled backwards, losing his balance. I reached for him, but it was too late. "Sup?" The creature lunged, covering the remaining distance in a single bound. Its claws raked across Rhett's legs as he tried to scramble away, drawing a scream that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Blood sprayed across the dirt as the beast's teeth found his shoulder, tearing through flesh and muscle with horrific efficiency. "Rhett!" I screamed, desperation overwhelming fear. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and hurled it at the creature. It connected, singing its matted fur and drawing an inhuman shriek of rage. The monster released Rhett, turning its attention to me. Those eyes burned with something beyond animal fury now. There was calculation there, and a terrible intelligence that spoke of deliberate malice. Rhett lay on the ground, blood pooling beneath him, his breathing shallow and ragged. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw something in his gaze that broke my heart. Understanding. He knew what I had to do. The creature began moving toward me with predatory grace, forcing me to back away from my injured friend. My mind raced, evaluating options that all seemed equally hopeless. The truck was still too far, the cabin barely closer. I had seconds to make a decision that would haunt me forever. I ran. The sound of my feet pounding against the earth was drowned out by the creature's roar of triumph behind me. I didn't look back. Couldn't look back. The truck's keys were in my pocket, my hands already fumbling for them as I sprinted across the yard. I made it to the driver's side door, just as I heard the creature's claws scraping against metal behind me. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the truck into reverse, then drive, tires spinning in the dirt before finding purchase. As I sped down the gravel road, my last glimpse in the rearview mirror showed the creature standing in the yard, Rhett's motionless form at its feet. Its eyes caught the truck's taillights, 2 points of hellish red in the gathering darkness. The drive to town was a blur of tears and terror. I barely remember stumbling into the sheriff's office, babbling about an attack, about Rhett being hurt. They organized a search party, of course. But by the time they reached the cabin, there was nothing left but blood trails leading into the deep woods. The official story was simple. Animal attack, probably a bear, tragic but not unprecedented. They searched for days but found no sign of Rhett or the creature. Local newspapers ran small articles about a missing hiker, and life in the small town went on. But I knew the truth. Those eyes haunted my dreams, turning every night into a fresh horror. I moved back in with my parents, unable to face living alone. They watched me with worried eyes as I withdrew from the world, jumping at shadows and flinching at every unexpected sound. Months passed. I tried therapy, but how do you explain something like this? How do you tell someone that monsters are real, that they hunt in the dark places of the world? The therapist talked about trauma and grief, prescribed medications that dulled the edges but couldn't erase what I'd seen. Then came the news that changed everything. 2 hikers found remains in a remote area just across the state line. DNA confirmed it was Rhett, but the condition of the bones... The medical examiner's report used words like unprecedented and inexplicable. The marks on the bones didn't match any known predator. That night, something inside me shifted. The fear that had paralyzed me for months transformed into something else. Purpose. I began preparing. The local hunting supply store became my second home. I studied tracking, survival skills, and everything I could find about the region's history and folklore. But my father thought I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. But I knew I couldn't rest until I finished this. I owed Rhett that much. 3 months later, I returned to the cabin. This time, I was ready. My truck was loaded with supplies, high-powered rifles, motion sensors, infrared cameras. If the creature was still out there, I would find it. The first few nights were quiet. Too quiet. The forest itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. On the 4th night, I saw them again, those burning eyes at the edge of my camp. But this time, I didn't run. The hunt lasted for days. The creature led me on a twisted path through the mountains, always staying just out of sight, leaving only tracks and the occasional glimpse to follow. It was toying with me, I realized, leading me somewhere. The final confrontation came in a clearing dominated by an ancient oak tree. The creature emerged from the shadows not as a hunter this time, but as something almost curious. It stood upright, its full height emphasized by the moonlight, and for a moment I saw what it truly was. Something old, something that had walked these mountains long before humans came, and would probably walk them long after we were gone. But it had taken Rhett, and for that, it had to answer. The fight was brief but brutal. My first shot caught it in the shoulder, drawing a screech that shook leaves from the trees. It charged, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. But I was ready this time. 3 more shots, center mass, and the creature stumbled. As it lay there, bleeding out under the moon's cold light, those eyes met mine one last time. There was something almost like respect in them now, mixed with its dying rage. Then the light faded, and it was just another body in the woods. I buried it deep, marking the spot with stones in a pattern I'd found in my grandfather's old journals. Then I burned sage and said the words he'd written down, just in case. Some things shouldn't be left to chance. They call it the Ozark stalker now. The story has become something of a local legend, whispered around campfires and debated on cryptozoology forums. Most people treat it as just another tall tale, another mystery to add to the mountain's long history of unexplained events. I sold the cabin. Couldn't bear to keep it, knowing what had happened there. But I still dream about those woods, about eyes burning in the darkness. Sometimes I dream about Rhett too. In these dreams, he's at peace, somehow understanding why things happened the way they did. I've never told the full story until now. Most nights I can almost convince myself it was all a terrible nightmare, but then I'll hear a wolf howl in the distance or catch movement in the corner of my eye, and I'll remember there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that live in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. And sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls through the trees, I wonder if that creature was really the last of its kind. After all, the mountains are vast, and their shadows are deep. The Chippewa National Forest sprawls across northern Minnesota like a dark green tapestry, its ancient pines and hardwoods stretching endlessly toward the horizon. That's where I found myself in the spring of 2023, perched in a fire lookout tower that rose above the canopy like a lonely sentinel. My name is Ryan Wildspirit, and at 35, I was running from the wreckage of my former life in Minneapolis. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd taken a job watching for fires when I'd just burned my own life to the ground. A failed marriage, a struggling art gallery, and mounting debts had pushed me to seek solitude in one of the most isolated positions I could find. My father's Ojibwe heritage had always drawn me to these woods, though I'd never fully embraced that part of my identity until now. The tower itself was a stark structure. A 100-foot steel frame topped by a 7x7 cabin with windows on all sides. My whole world had been reduced to this small space and the panoramic view of endless forest it provided. Some might have found it claustrophobic, but to me, it was freedom. I'd known Remy Martinez, my supervisor, since my college days at the University of Minnesota. We'd both studied environmental science, though he'd stayed the course while I'd drifted into the arts. When my life imploded, he was the one who suggested this position. "You need space to heal," he'd said, "and there's plenty of space up there." During my first week, Remy showed me the ropes. How to spot the telltale signs of smoke, use the Osborne firefinder to pinpoint locations, and maintain the various equipment that kept me connected to the outside world. But most importantly, he taught me about the rhythm of the forest. "This isn't just about watching for fires," he explained, his weathered face serious. "You're becoming part of something ancient here. These woods have stories, Ryan. Some of them aren't meant for human ears." I laughed it off at the time, but those words would come back to haunt me in the months ahead. The first month passed uneventfully. I settled into a routine. Wake at dawn, check equipment, scan the horizon, log weather conditions, repeat. The solitude suited me. My only regular contact was the twice-daily radio check-ins with Remy and occasional visits from supply runners. I spent my free time sketching the landscape and wildlife, filling notebook after notebook with drawings of hawks riding thermals, deer moving through clearings, and the ever-changing play of light through the trees. For the first time since my divorce, I felt creative again. But then things began to change. It started with small inconsistencies. Items in my cabin moved from where I'd left them, supplies disappearing from the locked storage shed at the tower's base. At first I attributed it to forgetfulness or wild animals, but the precision of the disturbances suggested something else. One morning in late June, I descended the tower for my weekly ground check and found something that stopped me cold. Around the base of several nearby trees were strange markings, not the usual claw marks from bears or other wildlife, but deliberate patterns carved deep into the bark. They formed complex geometric shapes that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. I radioed Remy about it, trying to keep my voice casual. "Probably just some kids messing around," he said, but there was an edge to his voice I'd never heard before. "Just keep an eye out, okay?" That night I heard the screams for the first time. They came from deep in the forest. Not animal, not quite human. They started as a low keening that gradually rose to a pitch that set my teeth on edge. I tried to triangulate the source using the firefinder, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When I reported it the next morning, Remy was unusually quiet. "Ryan," he said finally, "there are things in those woods that don't show up in any guidebook. Things the old-timers used to talk about. Just be careful, okay?" I wanted to press him for more information, but static suddenly overwhelmed the radio, and when it cleared, he was gone. That's when I started keeping a journal of the strange occurrences. Looking back at those entries now, I can see how things escalated gradually, like a slow-building nightmare. But it wasn't until the hikers arrived that the true horror began to reveal itself. They appeared at dawn. Two figures stumbling out of the tree line, their clothes torn and dirty. Through my binoculars, I could see the terror on their faces. I radioed in their presence and descended the tower to meet them. Their names were Vega Rodriguez and Darnell Thompson, graduate students from the University of Wisconsin conducting research on forest fungi. The third member of their team, Sarah Chen, had vanished during the night. "We were sleeping," Darnell explained, his hands shaking as he clutched a cup of coffee. "Then there were these sounds, like nothing I've ever heard before." Sarah screamed, and by the time we got out of our tents, he trailed off, staring into the distance. "There was blood," Vega continued, her voice hollow. "So much blood, and marks in the ground like something had dragged her away. But the prints, they weren't animal tracks. They weren't human either." I radioed for help and assured them that search and rescue would arrive soon. But as the morning wore on and we waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest had gone silent. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, expectant quiet. When we found Sarah's remains later that day, everything changed. The body was arranged with an artificial precision that spoke of intelligence rather than animal instinct. The wounds showed patterns similar to the marks I'd found on the trees, but carved into flesh instead of bark. Vega vomited. Darnell wept. I radioed in our discovery with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. That night, as we huddled in my tower waiting for authorities to arrive, the screams began again. But this time they were closer, much closer. And they weren't alone. The screams grew closer as darkness settled over the forest. Vega, Darnell, and I huddled in the tower's cabin, watching shadows move unnaturally between the trees. The radio crackled with static, Remy's voice barely breaking through.
Ryan, coming to help. Stay put. Don't let it...
The transmission cut off abruptly. That's when we saw it for the first time. The creature emerged from the tree line like a living shadow, its proportions all wrong. It stood easily 15 feet tall, with limbs that seemed too long and jointed in impossible ways. Its skin was a mottled gray-black, not fur or scales, but something in between, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. The head was eyeless, yet I knew it could see us. A mouth filled with needle-like teeth opened in what might have been a smile.
"Oh, God,"
Darnell whispered. "That's what took Sarah." The thing moved with unnatural speed, covering the distance to the tower's base in 3 fluid strides. The entire structure shuddered as it began to climb, metal groaning under its weight. Vega screamed, and I pushed them both toward the emergency hatch in the floor. "The maintenance ladder," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's our only chance." We descended as quietly as possible, the creature's movements above masking our own. The ladder seemed endless, each rung a potential betrayal in the darkness. When my feet finally touched the ground, I looked up to see 2 more sets of glowing eyes emerging from the forest. There were more of them. "Run!" I shouted, abandoning any pretense of stealth. We fled into the woods, the sounds of pursuit close behind. Branches whipped at our faces as we crashed through the undergrowth. The creatures moved through the trees above us, their bodies flowing like liquid shadow from branch to branch. Darnell fell first. I heard his scream cut short, and knew better than to look back. Vega sobbed as we ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The ranger cabin I'd spotted during my patrols was ahead, our only hope for shelter. We were 20 yards from safety when one of the creatures dropped from the canopy directly in front of us. Up close, its wrongness was even more apparent. The skin rippled with patterns similar to the tree markings, but these seemed to move and shift, forming symbols that hurt to look at. Vega turned to run, but another creature was already there. They had corralled us, herding us like prey. I grabbed a fallen branch, knowing it was useless but unwilling to die without a fight. The first creature reached for us with elongated fingers ending in obsidian claws, but before it could strike, a piercing whistle cut through the night. The creatures froze, heads tilting in perfect unison toward the sound. Through the trees came a figure I never expected to see. Remy, holding what looked like an ancient bone flute. He played a series of notes that made my teeth ache, and the creatures retreated several steps. "The old ways," Remy shouted. "They remember the old ways." He tossed something to me, a small leather pouch. Inside was a handful of what looked like dried herbs and small bones. "Spread it in a circle," he commanded, still playing. "Quickly." I did as he said, my hands shaking as I created a circle around Vega and myself. The creatures paced at its edge but wouldn't cross the line. Their movements became more agitated as Remy's song reached a crescendo. With an otherworldly shriek, they retreated into the darkness. The forest fell silent once more. Dawn found us huddled in Remy's cabin, clutching mugs of strong coffee laced with something stronger. Vega had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, but I needed answers. What were those things? I asked. Remy sighed, suddenly looking much older than his years. The Ojibwe called them Manitous, spirits that were here long before humans. Most are neutral or even beneficial, but some. He trailed off, staring into his mug. Why didn't you warn me? Would you have believed me? Besides, they rarely reveal themselves so boldly. Something's changed. They're getting more aggressive, more desperate. He explained how his grandmother had taught him the old ways, how to recognize signs of the Manitous, how to ward them off with sacred herbs and ancient songs. The forest was their domain, and humans were merely guests who had overstayed their welcome. But why take people? Why? I couldn't finish the thought, remembering Sarah's mutilated body. They're marking their territory, Remy said grimly, sending a message. This forest is dying, Ryan. Climate change, logging, development, their world is shrinking. And they're angry. The official investigation found nothing, of course. Darnell's body was never recovered. The authorities blamed animal attacks, possibly bears or wolves. Vega and I knew better, but who would believe us? I resigned from my position the next day. Some nightmares you don't recover from, some sights you can't unsee. But leaving didn't end it. Not really. The creatures had marked us somehow, branded us with their otherworldly presence. I dream about them still. In my darkest moments, I see those shifting patterns on their skin, trying to form messages I can't quite read. Sometimes I wake to find similar marks carved into my bedroom walls, only to have them vanish in daylight. Vega and I keep in touch. She's living in Arizona now, as far from forests as she can get. Her emails often end with the same question. Do you think they'll find us? I don't have the heart to tell her that they never lost us. That sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear that keening cry in the distance. That I've seen shadows move in impossible ways even in the heart of Minneapolis. Remy still works in the forest, protecting what secrets he can. He sends me updates occasionally, warning of increased activity or new disappearances. The herbs he gave me that night hang in a pouch around my neck, a reminder and a safeguard. The fire tower still stands, though no one staffs it anymore. Too many accidents, they say. Too many unexplained incidents. On clear days, I can see it from certain spots in the city, rising above the tree line like a warning. Some stories don't have clean endings. Some horrors don't fade with time. The creatures are still out there, watching, waiting. And the forest holds its secrets close, sharing them only with those unfortunate enough to learn the truth about what really lurks in the spaces between the trees. I know now why my father's people treated these lands with such reverence and fear. The woods are not empty, and we are not alone. Remember that, if you ever find yourself in the deep forest, where the shadows move wrong and the silence speaks volumes. And if you hear screaming in the night, pray it's just the wind. This happened to me a few years back, just outside a small town up in the Olympic Mountains. I'm Will, by the way. City born and bred, always been more of a coffee shops and streetlights kind of guy. But my girlfriend Sarah, she's an outdoors woman through and through, a ranger for the National Park Service. That summer, she got stationed at a remote outpost for fire watch season. We figured it'd be a nice change of pace for me, a romantic getaway in the wilderness. Turns out nothing kills romance faster than mosquitoes and outhouse duty. The drive up to the outpost was beautiful, I'll give it that. Towering evergreens lined the winding road, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the asphalt. But as we climbed higher into the mountains, the beauty took on an ominous edge. The trees seemed to press closer, their shadows deeper and more menacing. I caught Sarah glancing at me, a hint of worry in her eyes. You okay, Will? She asked, her hand finding mine on the center console. I forced a smile. Yeah, it's a lot, you know, different from the city. She squeezed my hand. You'll get used to it. The quiet can be unsettling at first, but there's something magical about being out here, away from it all. I nodded, not entirely convinced. As we rounded another bend, the trees parted, revealing our home for the next few months. The ranger cabin was a squat, weathered structure, its wooden walls bleached gray by countless seasons of sun and rain. A rickety porch wrapped around two sides, and a stone chimney jutted from the sloped roof. It looked like something out of an old horror movie, the kind where naive campers meet grisly ends. Sarah must have sensed my unease. She parked the Jeep and turned to face me, her expression serious. Will, I know this is a big change for you. If you're having second thoughts. I cut her off with a quick kiss. No second thoughts. I want to be here with you. It's just going to take some adjusting. Her smile was radiant, chasing away some of the shadows that seemed to cling to the edges of my vision. That's my guy. Come on, let's get settled in. The inside of the cabin was surprisingly cozy. A pot-bellied stove dominated one corner, flanked by a small kitchenette. A sturdy wooden table with mismatched chairs served as both dining area and Sarah's makeshift office. A narrow hallway led to a tiny bedroom and an even tinier bathroom. It was rustic, but clean and well-maintained. As Sarah bustled about, unpacking supplies and checking her equipment, I found myself drawn to the windows. The forest pressed close, a solid wall of green broken only by the narrow path that led to the Jeep. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, observed by countless unseen eyes hidden in the depths of the woods. Hey, Sarah's voice startled me. She was holding out a mug of steaming coffee. Thought you could use this. First night jitters? I took the mug gratefully, inhaling the familiar aroma. Something like that. It's just so quiet out here. Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. It can be overwhelming at first. But trust me, once you start listening, you'll realize it's not quiet at all. There's a whole world out there, Will. You just have to learn how to hear it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Sarah walked me through the basics of cabin life. How to work the generator, where to store food to keep it safe from bears, the proper way to dispose of waste so as not to attract wildlife. It was a lot to take in, but I was determined to make this work. That night, as we lay in the narrow bed, the unfamiliar sounds of the forest keeping me awake, Sarah snuggled close. I'm really glad you're here, she whispered. I wrapped my arms around her, drawing comfort from her warmth. Me too, I replied, and I meant it. Despite my unease, there was something thrilling about being out here, facing this new adventure together. But as I drifted off to sleep, a sound cut through the night. A long, low howl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a wolf or any other animal I could identify. It was something else. Something that sent a chill down my spine and had me pulling Sarah closer, suddenly very aware of how exposed we were out here in the wilderness. Little did I know that haunting cry was just the beginning of a nightmare that would change our lives forever. The first few days were uneventful, mostly me just trying not to whine too much while Sarah checked her map grids and radioed in reports. But even then, there was this feeling prickling at the back of my neck, like the forest was holding its breath. The quiet was the worst, no birdsong like I was used to, just this heavy, empty silence. Sarah chalked it up to the time of year, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was out there. On our third morning, I woke to find Sarah already dressed and packing a day bag. She smiled when she saw me stirring. Morning, sleepyhead. I've got to do a perimeter check today. Want to come along? Shh. The thought of venturing deeper into the woods sent a shiver through me, but I nodded. Sure, yeah, let me just grab some coffee first. As we hiked along the narrow trail, Sarah pointed out various plants and animal tracks. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself relaxing slightly, caught up in her excitement. But then, we came to a clearing, and everything changed. The grass was flattened in a wide circle, as if something large had been thrashing about. At the center lay the carcass of a deer, or what was left of one. Its rib cage was splayed open, picked clean of flesh. What struck me most was the unnatural angle of its neck, twisted almost completely around. Sarah's ranger training kicked in. She approached the carcass cautiously, camera in hand, to document the scene. "This is unusual," she muttered, snapping photos. "Unusual how?" I asked, fighting the urge to run back to the cabin. She glanced up at me, her expression grim. "The kill pattern. It's not consistent with any predator I'm familiar with. Too messy for a cougar, too calculated for a bear." As she continued her examination, I scanned the tree line. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and writhe, playing tricks on my eyes. A twig snapped somewhere in the undergrowth, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Mom." "Sarah?" I called, my voice tight with fear. "I think we should go. Now." She must have heard the urgency in my tone because she didn't argue. We made our way back to the cabin in tense silence, both of us glancing over our shoulders every few steps. That night, as we sat by the crackling fire in the pot-bellied stove, Sarah pored over her field guide. "I just can't make sense of it," she muttered, frustration evident in her voice. "The bite marks, the way the carcass was arranged. It doesn't fit any known predator in this region." I sipped my coffee, trying to ignore the shadows that danced at the edges of the firelight. Could it be, I don't know, some kind of hybrid? Or maybe an animal that's not supposed to be here? Sarah shook her head. "Possible, but unlikely. The Olympic Mountains are a pretty isolated ecosystem. It's not easy for new species to just wander in unnoticed." A gust of wind rattled the windows, making us both jump. Sarah reached for my hand, her grip tight. "Will, I think I need to report this. It could be nothing, but if there's some unknown predator out there..." I nodded, relieved that she was taking this seriously. "Yeah, that's probably a good idea." As Sarah made her way to the radio to call it in, I found myself drawn to the window again. The forest was a sea of darkness, broken only by the faint glimmer of starlight filtering through the canopy. And there, just at the edge of visibility, I saw it. A pair of eyes, reflecting the dim light from the cabin. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, and they were fixed directly on me. I blinked, and they were gone. But the chill that ran through me lingered long into the night. The days that followed were tense. Sarah's superiors had instructed her to keep a close eye on the situation, but hadn't deemed it serious enough to send additional personnel. We fell into an uneasy routine, Sarah going about her ranger duties while I tried to keep myself occupied around the cabin. But the nights were the worst. The howls we'd heard that first evening became a regular occurrence, always distant, but growing closer with each passing day. Sometimes they were answered by other cries, different in pitch, but equally chilling. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring against us, whispering dark secrets just beyond our understanding. One night, about a week after we'd found the deer carcass, I woke with a start. The cabin was pitch black, the fire having died down to embers. Sarah's steady breathing beside me told me she was still asleep. But something had roused me, some noise or presence that set every nerve on edge. I lay there, heart pounding, straining my ears for any sound out of place. For a long moment, there was nothing but the usual nighttime chorus of crickets and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. Then I heard it. A low, rhythmic scratching sound coming from just outside the cabin wall. Slowly, Careful not to wake Sarah, I slid out of bed. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the scratching stopped abruptly. I froze, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the sound resumed, more insistent now. I crept to the window, my hand shaking as I reached for the curtain. Part of me screamed to leave it closed, to crawl back into bed and pretend this was all a bad dream, but I had to know. With a deep breath, I pulled the curtain aside just enough to peer out. The moon was full, casting an eerie silvery light over the clearing. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then a shadow moved, detaching itself from the darkness at the forest's edge. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, and covered in thick matted fur. Its body was a strange mix of human and animal proportions, with long arms that ended in wickedly curved claws. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Vaguely canine in shape, with a long snout filled with gleaming teeth, but with eyes that were disturbingly human. And those eyes were fixed directly on me. I stumbled back from the window, a scream lodged in my throat. The creature let out a low growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the cabin. Then, with impossible speed for something so large, it loped across the clearing and disappeared into the tree line.
Will?
Sarah's groggy voice called from the bedroom.
What's going on?
I couldn't find the words to answer her. How could I explain what I'd just seen? How could I make her understand the terror that now gripped me? And as Sarah came into the room, rubbing sleep from her eyes, I finally managed to choke out, "We're not alone out here. There's something in the woods. Something that shouldn't exist." The next morning, over steaming mugs of coffee, I recounted what I'd seen to Sarah. To her credit, she listened without interruption, her face growing more serious with each detail I shared. When I finished, she set down her mug and reached for my hand.
"Will,"
she said softly,
"I believe you."
Those 3 words were like a lifeline, anchoring me in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly unfamiliar. Sarah squeezed my hand, her eyes meeting mine with a mix of concern and determination.
"There have been stories," she continued, choosing her words carefully. "Legends, really. The old-timers at the ranger station, they sometimes talk about things in these woods. Things that don't show up in any field guide."
I leaned forward, hanging on her every word.
"What kind of things?"
Sarah took a deep breath.
"They call them different names.
Sasquatch, Bigfoot. But the local tribes have another name. They call them the Shadow Walkers, creatures that walk on 2 legs but aren't human. Guardians of the forest, some say. Others claim they're more like judges, punishing those who disrespect the wilderness." A chill ran down my spine. "And you've heard these stories before? Why didn't you say anything?" She shook her head, a hint of guilt in her expression. "I didn't want to scare you. And honestly, I always thought they were just that. Stories. Something to spook the newbies or keep campers from wandering off trail. But now..." Her voice trailed off, and we sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what we were facing settling over us like a heavy blanket. Finally, Sarah stood, her ranger training kicking in.
"We need more information," she said, her voice taking on a professional tone. "I'm going to radio the station, see if they can put us in touch with some of the tribal elders.
Maybe they know more about what we're dealing with." As Sarah made her way to the radio, I found myself drawn to the window again. The forest looked different now, knowing what secrets it held. Every shadow seemed to conceal a lurking threat, every rustle of leaves a potential warning. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tense waiting and hushed conversations. Sarah's superiors were skeptical but agreed to arrange a meeting with a tribal elder who lived in the nearest town. We were to drive down the next morning, a prospect that filled me with equal parts relief and dread. Relief at the thought of leaving the isolated cabin, dread at what we might learn. Loss. That night, as we lay in bed, neither of us able to sleep, Sarah turned to me.
Will,
She whispered.
whatever happens tomorrow, whatever we find out, we're in this together, okay?
I pulled her close, drawing comfort from her warmth and strength.
Together.
I echoed, trying to sound more confident than I felt. As if in response, a howl echoed through the night, closer than ever before. Sarah and I clung to each other, listening as it was answered by another, then another, until it seemed the entire forest was alive with the cries of creatures that shouldn't exist. Morning couldn't come soon enough. The drive into town was tense, both of us jumping at every movement in the underbrush along the road. The forest seemed to press in on all sides, the trees forming a claustrophobic tunnel that made me feel like we were descending into the belly of some great beast. We met the tribal elder, a man named Joseph, at a small diner on the outskirts of town. His weathered face was a map of wrinkles, each line seeming to hold a story of its own. As we settled into a booth, his dark eyes studied us intently. "So," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "you've seen them." It wasn't a question. Sarah and I exchanged glances before I nodded. "Yes, I think so. We've heard things too. Howls like nothing I've ever heard before." Joseph closed his eyes for a moment, as if in pain. When he opened them again, there was a deep sadness there. "The Shadow Walkers. We had hoped, but no. They are awakening again." Sarah leaned forward, her ranger's notebook open before her. "Mr. Joseph, can you tell us more about these creatures? What are they? Where do they come from?" The old man sighed, his gaze drifting to the window, to the forest beyond. "They are as old as these mountains, maybe older. In the time before, when the world was young, they walked freely. Guardians, yes, but also judges. They kept the balance between man and nature." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee before continuing. "But as man grew in numbers and in greed, the Shadow Walkers retreated. They sleep for long years, sometimes centuries, but they always return when the balance is threatened." A chill ran down my spine. "Are you saying they're awake now because of us?"
Oh, because we're here? Joseph shook his head slowly. "Not you specifically, but your presence, the presence of more and more people in these woods. It disturbs them. The balance is shifting, and they have risen to set it right." Sarah's pen scratched furiously across her notebook. "How do we stop them? Or can we?" The old man's eyes flickered with something that might have been fear. "Stop them? Number. You don't stop forces of nature. You can only hope to survive them, to learn to live in harmony with the world they protect. So." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Listen carefully. The Shadow Walkers, they are not evil. Not in the way you might think. They are like the storm, like the earthquake. Terrible, yes, but part of the natural order. They cull those who threaten the balance." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Cull? You mean they kill people?" Joseph nodded gravely. "Those who show disrespect to the forest, who take more than they need, who disturb the ancient places. Yes, they are judged and found wanting." Sarah's hand found mine under the table, squeezing tight. "How do we avoid their judgment? How do we stay safe?" The old man's eyes softened slightly. "You already know. Respect the land. Take only what you need. And most importantly, stay away from their sacred places." "Sacred places?" I echoed. Joseph nodded. "There are caves, deep in the mountains. Places where the veil between worlds is thin. The Shadow Walkers guard these places fiercely. If you value your lives, stay far away from them." As we left the diner,
The weight of Joseph's words hung heavy over us. The drive back to the cabin was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The forest, which had seemed merely ominous before, now felt actively hostile. Every shadow held the potential for danger, every rustle of leaves a possible threat. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and mounting dread. We went about our duties, Sarah patrolling her designated areas, me trying to keep the cabin in order. But every moment was colored by the knowledge of what lurked in the woods around us. One afternoon, about a week after our meeting with Joseph, Sarah returned from a patrol looking pale and shaken. She burst through the cabin door, slamming it behind her and leaning against it, breathing heavily. "Sarah?" I rushed to her side. "What happened? Are you okay?" She shook her head, eyes wide with fear. "I saw one, Will. Up close. It was... God. It was terrifying." I guided her to a chair, pressing a glass of water into her trembling hands. "Tell me everything." Sarah took a deep breath, centering herself. "I was checking the eastern ridge near that old mining trail. There's a cave system up there that we're supposed to keep an eye on, make sure no hikers wander in and get lost." She paused, taking a long drink of water before continuing. "As I approached the main entrance, I heard something. A low, rumbling sound, like nothing I've ever heard before. It was coming from inside the cave. I felt a chill run down my spine, remembering Joseph's warning about sacred places. What did you do?" "I should have left," Sarah admitted. "But I'm a ranger, Will. It's my job to investigate, so I turned on my flashlight and stepped into the cave." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The smell hit me first. Like wet dog and rotting meat. Then I saw it. It was hunched over something. I think it might have been a deer carcass, but I can't be sure. It was huge, Will. Bigger than any bear I've ever seen. And its fur, it wasn't like any animal I know. It was patchy, almost mangy in places, with skin showing through that looked wrong, too human somehow." I reached out, taking her hand in mine. "Did it see you?" Sarah nodded, her face ashen. It turned and looked right at me. Its eyes, Will. They were intelligent, aware. It knew exactly what I was, and I could see it deciding whether or not I was a threat. "What happened then?" I asked, hardly daring to breathe. It spoke to me," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Not in words, not exactly. But I heard it in my head. It said, 'Leave this place. You do not belong here.'" Shaw. I felt the blood drain from my face. "And then?" "I ran," Sarah said simply. "I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I didn't stop until I got back here." We sat in silence for a long moment, the gravity of the situation settling over us like a shroud. Finally, I spoke. "We need to leave, Sarah. We need to get out of these woods." But Sarah shook her head, a determined look replacing the fear in her eyes. "We can't, Will. Don't you see? This is bigger than us now. If these creatures are real, if they're as dangerous as Joseph said, we have a responsibility to warn people, to protect them." I wanted to argue, to insist that our safety was more important than any perceived duty. But I knew Sarah was right. We couldn't just walk away, not now that we knew the truth. "Okay," I said, squeezing her hand. "So what do we do?" Sarah's jaw set in a determined line. "We gather evidence. Hard proof that these creatures exist. Then we take it to the authorities, make them listen. It's the only way to keep people safe." As night fell, we made our plans. We would set up trail cameras, document any signs of the creature's presence, and if we were very careful and very lucky, maybe even capture photographic evidence of the shadow walkers themselves. Little did we know, our actions would set in motion a chain of events that would push us to the very limits of human endurance and sanity. The next few days were a flurry of activity. We set up trail cameras at strategic points around the cabin and near the cave where Sarah had her encounter. Each day we ventured a little further into the woods, always together, always armed with Sarah's Ranger-issue rifle and a growing arsenal of improvised weapons. The forest seemed to close in around us, the very air thick with menace. More than once we caught glimpses of movement just at the edge of our vision. A flash of fur, the gleam of eyes in the underbrush. The howls continued nightly, sometimes so close it felt like the creatures were right outside our door. On the 5th day of our self-imposed mission, we made a chilling discovery. One of our trail cameras, the one closest to the cave system, had been destroyed. Not just turned off or damaged, but literally torn apart, its components scattered across the forest floor. As Sarah knelt to examine the wreckage, I kept watch, the rifle held ready. "This was deliberate," she muttered, turning over a twisted piece of plastic. "They knew what it was, what it could do. They're intelligent, Will. Maybe even more than we realized." A twig snapped somewhere in the trees behind us, and we both whirled around, hearts pounding. For a long moment we stood frozen, straining our eyes and ears for any sign of threat. The forest had gone eerily silent, not even the chirp of a bird to break the oppressive quiet. Then we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It raised the hair on the back of my neck, every instinct screaming at me to run. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice tight with fear. "We need to go, now." She nodded, her face pale but determined. We began to back away slowly, eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. We had almost reached the relative safety of the trail when a figure burst from the underbrush, moving with impossible speed. It was one of them, a shadow walker. Up close, it was even more terrifying than I had imagined. Its body was a twisted amalgamation of human and animal features, covered in thick, matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of wolf and man, with the elongated snout filled with razor-sharp teeth and eyes that burned with an unsettling intelligence. Sarah raised the rifle, but before she could fire, the creature was upon us. With a swipe of its massive paw, it sent the weapon flying into the underbrush. I felt a searing pain across my chest as its claws raked through my jacket, drawing blood. Sarah screamed my name, and I saw her lunge for the fallen rifle. The shadow walker turned its attention to her, letting out a bone-chilling roar. In that moment, fueled by terror and desperate love, I did the only thing I could think of. I threw myself at the creature's back. It was like hitting a brick wall covered in coarse hair. The shadow walker stumbled, momentarily thrown off balance. I clung to its massive form, my arms wrapped around its neck in a chokehold that would have incapacitated a human but seemed to only annoy this monstrous being. With a snarl of rage, it reached back, grabbing me by the scruff of my neck with horrifying strength. I felt myself being lifted, then hurled through the air. The world spun around me, and then I hit something hard. A tree, I realized dimly, and everything went black. I came to with Sarah's face hovering over me, her eyes wide with panic. Will, can you hear me? We have to move." Pain lanced through my body as she helped me to my feet. My vision swam and I tasted blood in my mouth. The thing," I mumbled. "Where?" "It's gone," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "For now. But we need to get back to the cabin. You're hurt bad, Will." As we stumbled through the woods, Sarah supporting most of my weight, I drifted in and out of consciousness. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. Every shadow held the potential for death, every sound a possible harbinger of the shadow walker's return.
By some miracle, we made it back to the cabin. Sarah barricaded the door behind us, then set about tending to my wounds. As the adrenaline wore off, the full extent of my injuries became apparent. Deep gashes across my chest and back, bruised, possibly broken ribs, and a concussion that left the world spinning around me. As Sarah cleaned and bandaged the worst of the cuts, her hands steady despite the fear I could see in her eyes, I knew we had crossed a line. This was no longer about gathering evidence or warning others. This was about survival. The Shadow Walkers had made their judgment, and we had been found wanting. The next few days passed in a haze of pain and fever dreams. Sarah tended to my wounds as best she could with our limited first aid supplies, but infection had set in, leaving me weak and delirious. Through the fog of my illness, I was vaguely aware of Sarah's growing desperation. She tried to radio for help, but all she got was static. The satellite phone, our last link to the outside world, was dead. Its batteries drained and our solar charger mysteriously damaged. We were cut off, trapped in our tiny cabin with unknown horrors lurking in the woods around us. On the third night after the attack, I woke to the sound of Sarah's muffled sobs. She was huddled by the window, rifle clutched to her chest, staring out into the darkness. "Sarah," I croaked, my throat dry and painful. "What's wrong?" She turned to me, her face pale and drawn in the dim light of our battery-powered lantern. "They're out there, Will." Watching us. Waiting. I struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain that shot through my battered body. "You've seen them?" Sarah nodded, her eyes wide and haunted. They're surrounding the cabin. I count at least 5 of them. They just stand there watching. Sometimes one of them will approach, scratch at the walls, but they haven't tried to break in. Not yet. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with my fever. "What do they want?" I don't know," Sarah whispered, "but I don't think they're going to let us leave." As if in response to her words, a howl rose from the woods, closer than ever before. It was answered by another, then another, until the night was filled with a chorus of unearthly cries that made my blood run cold. Sarah moved to my side, helping me to my feet. "Come on," she said, her voice tight with fear. "We need to get away from the windows." We huddled together in the center of the main room, Sarah's arm around me, supporting my weight. The howls continued, rising and falling in a terrible melody that spoke of hunger and ancient primal rage. Then, suddenly, silence fell. The quiet was almost worse than the howls, a pregnant pause filled with dreadful anticipation. Sarah's grip on the rifle tightened, her knuckles white with tension. A heavy thud against the cabin wall made us both jump. Then another, and another. It was as if the creatures were hurling themselves at the structure, testing its strength. "The roof," I gasped, a horrible realization dawning. "Sarah, the roof. It's not as strong as the walls." Her eyes widened in understanding and fear. Just as the words left my mouth, we heard it, the sound of claws scrabbling on the wooden shingles above us. The battery-powered lantern flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. In the pitch black, the sounds from above became even more terrifying. The crack of breaking wood, the thud of heavy bodies moving across the ceiling. Sarah fumbled in her pocket, producing a small flashlight. Its beam seemed pitifully inadequate against the encroaching darkness, but it was all we had. A section of the roof caved in with a thunderous crash, showering us with splinters and debris. In the wavering beam of the flashlight, I caught a glimpse of matted fur, of gleaming claws and teeth. Sarah raised the rifle, firing off 2 quick shots. The sound was deafening in the confined space of the cabin. A howl of pain told us at least one shot had found its mark, but it seemed to only enrage the creatures further. More of the roof gave way, and I felt the rush of cold night air.
The beam of Sarah's flashlight danced wildly around the room, illuminating flashes of our attackers. Here a pair of glowing eyes, there the sweep of a powerful, fur-covered arm. "The bedroom!" Sarah shouted over the din of breaking wood and inhuman snarls. "We can barricade ourselves in." Supporting each other, we stumbled towards the narrow hallway that led to the bedroom. Behind us, I heard the main door of the cabin splinter and give way. They were inside. We barely made it to the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind us. Sarah wedged a chair under the doorknob while I leaned against it, my injuries screaming in protest. The sounds of destruction from the main room were horrifying. Furniture being smashed, glass breaking, the walls themselves seeming to groan under the assault of the shadow walkers. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence that fell was somehow even more terrifying than the chaos that had preceded it. Sarah and I looked at each other, barely daring to breathe. A low, rumbling voice came from just outside the bedroom door. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something horrifyingly in between. "You do not belong here," it growled. "This place is not for you. Leave, or face judgment." Sarah's hand found mine in the darkness, squeezing tight. We both knew there was nowhere left to run. The siege had begun, and our chances of survival were growing slimmer by the moment. Time lost all meaning as we huddled in that small bedroom, every creak and groan of the cabin setting our nerves on edge. The shadow walkers seemed content to wait us out, their presence a constant, suffocating weight just beyond the thin wooden door. Sarah's flashlight had long since died, leaving us in near total darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the bedroom's single tiny window. It cast long shadows that seemed to writhe and twist, playing tricks on our exhausted minds. My fever had spiked again, leaving me drifting in and out of consciousness. In my more lucid moments, I was aware of Sarah's quiet determination as she tended to my wounds, rationed our meager supplies, and kept constant vigil. As the hours stretched into days, our situation grew increasingly desperate. Our food and water were running low, and the stench of decay from the ruined main room of the cabin seeped under the door, a constant reminder of the horrors that awaited us. On what I estimated to be the third day of our confinement, Sarah shook me awake from a fevered sleep. Her face was gaunt, her eyes wild with a mix of fear and determination. "Will," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse, "I think I have a plan. But it's dangerous, maybe even suicide." I struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain that still radiated from my wounds. "At this point, I think we're dead either way. What's the plan?" Sarah took a deep breath. "The cave system, the one where I first saw the creature. I think it might be their lair, their sacred place." "What?" I felt a chill run down my spine, remembering Joseph's warnings. "Sarah, no, we can't go there. It's too dangerous." She shook her head, a fierce light in her eyes. "It's our only chance, Will. If we can get there, maybe we can, I don't know, negotiate, or at least understand why they're doing this." I wanted to argue, to tell her it was madness, but looking into her eyes, I saw the truth of our situation. We were out of options. It was risk everything on this insane plan, or wait here to die. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "How do we get past them?" "Beth." Sarah's plan was as desperate as it was daring. Using the last of our supplies, we would create a distraction, a small fire in the bedroom to draw the shadow walkers' attention. In the chaos, we would slip out through the window and make a run for the cave system. As night fell, we put our plan into action. Sarah piled our remaining clothes and papers in the center of the room, then used the last of our matches to set them ablaze. The smoke quickly filled the small space, making our eyes water and our lungs burn. We heard the creatures outside stir, their growls turning to snarls of confusion and anger. As the first tendrils of smoke seeped under the door, Sarah helped me to the window. With the last of my strength, I forced it open. Yeah. The cool night air hit us like a shock, clearing our smoke-addled senses. Sarah went first, dropping silently to the ground outside. I followed, my injured body protesting every movement. The impact of the short fall sent waves of pain through me, but Sarah was there, pulling me to my feet. "Run," she hissed, and we did. We plunged into the dark forest, the sounds of the enraged shadow walkers fading behind us. The trees seemed to close in, branches clawing at our faces and clothes. Every shadow held the potential for death, every sound a possible pursuer. By some miracle, we reached the base of the ridge where the cave system was located. The climb was agonizing, my wounds screaming with every step. Sarah half-carried me, her own reserves of strength nearing their limit. As we neared the cave entrance, a bone-chilling howl split the night. They had discovered our escape and were in pursuit. "We're not going to make it," I gasped, stumbling on the rocky ground. Sarah's grip on me tightened. "Yes, we are. We have to." We stumbled into the yawning mouth of the cave just as another howl, closer this time, echoed through the trees. The darkness inside was absolute, but Sarah pressed on, guiding us deeper into the earth. The air grew colder, damper. Strange echoes surrounded us. Dripping water, the skitter of unseen creatures, and something else. A low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from the very rock itself. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice tight with fear. "What is this place?" Before she could answer, a growl rumbled through the cavern. We froze, our hearts pounding in unison. In the faint light that filtered in from the cave mouth, I saw a pair of glowing eyes materialize from the darkness. It was one of them. A shadow walker, but different from the others we had encountered. Larger, somehow more ancient. Its fur was streaked with gray, its face bearing scars from countless battles. It regarded us with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. When it spoke, its voice was like gravel scraping against stone. "You have entered the sacred place," it growled. "You will be judged." Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. "We seek understanding. Why are you attacking us? What have we done to offend you?" The creature's eyes narrowed. "Your kind spreads like a disease. You take and take, giving nothing in return. The balance must be maintained." "But we're not like that," I protested, finding a reserve of strength I didn't know I had. "We respect the forest. We want to protect it." The Shadow Walker tilted its head, considering. "Words are wind. Actions are truth. You will be tested." Before we could react, more of the creatures melted out of the shadows surrounding us. They herded us deeper into the cave system, into a vast chamber where the strange, pulsing hum was strongest. In the center of the chamber stood a pillar of swirling, ethereal light. It pulsed in time with the hum, casting strange shadows on the cave walls. "The heart of the forest," the lead Shadow Walker intoned. "Touch it. Let it judge your worth." Sarah and I exchanged glances. There was no going back now. Hand in hand, we approached the pillar. As we reached out to touch it, I felt a moment of pure terror. What if we were found wanting? What if this was the end? The moment our fingers made contact with the light, the world exploded into sensation. I felt the pulse of every living thing in the forest, from the tiniest insect to the ancient trees. I saw the balance the Shadow Walkers fought to protect, the delicate interplay of life and death that sustained the ecosystem. And I understood. When the vision faded, I found myself on my knees, Sarah beside me. The Shadow Walkers watched us impassively, waiting. We understand now, Sarah said, her voice filled with awe and sadness. We'll leave this place. We'll tell others to stay away, to respect the balance. The lead shadow walker nodded slowly. You have been judged and found worthy of life. Go. But remember, we will always be watching. They escorted us out of the cave system, back to the edge of the forest. As the first light of dawn broke over the trees, the shadow walkers melted away into the underbrush, leaving us alone with our newfound understanding. Sarah and I made our way back to civilization, our story dismissed as the ravings of two people driven mad by isolation and fear. But we knew the truth. We had seen the heart of the forest, had been judged by forces beyond human comprehension. Now, years later, I still wake in the night, the echo of inhuman howls ringing in my ears. Sarah and I live on the edge of the city, close enough to the comforts of civilization, but always with one eye on the distant trees. For we know the truth that lurks in the shadows of the deep woods. We know that there are forces out there, ancient and powerful, that stand guard over the wild places of the world, and we know that to trespass in their domain is to risk a judgment from which there may be no appeal. The shadow walkers are out there, watching, waiting, and the balance must be maintained.